39.4% of the variance in running economy was explained by a combination of 3 different variables. That Triathlon Show 136. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we talk about the latest science in running form and how it can affect running economy and running performance. But first, big thank you to our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration. They are the sweat experts and they provide electrolyte products that help you stay hydrated and keep your electrolyte content up so that you can perform even when the day gets longer and the weather gets hotter. So you can check them out on precisionhydration.com and you can take their free online sweat test. I'll link to that in the show notes to find out what your individual electrolyte needs is, because there's no one size fits all when it comes to hydration. You need to find how much sodium you need to get for you specifically. And if you decide to buy any of their products, you can actually get your first box or tube for free when you use the promo code That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps, at checkout. So again, that's precisionhydration.com and the code is That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. And warm welcome to new sponsor of That Triathlon Show, Roka. You can find Roka on roka.com, that's ROKA.com. And if you're not familiar with them, I guess most of you are, but the way I described this to a couple of non-triathlete friends that are still interested in what I do with the podcast, they're basically, in my view at least, like the Nike of triathlon, because they are at the forefront of technology. Their research and development into their products is top class. It's really insane, and they're also one of the biggest brands, of course, for good reason, because the quality is really excellent. I want to share a little bit of my experience with Roka products because it's been great. I have used Roka products for quite some time, but now as part of the sponsorship, I also got sent some new products to try out, which I'm very grateful to the team at Roka. And today I want to mention the wetsuit, the Maverick X, which I have tried out in the last few weeks. And it's insane, really. I've been using it in pool workouts and in open water workouts. And basically, compared to my swimming without the wetsuit in the pool, I get easily off, for the same effort, I get 10 seconds per 100 meter faster when I'm in the wetsuit, which is a lot, especially considering that I'm no slouch without the wetsuit either. So to get that sort of time improvement with a wetsuit is unheard of. And I've had the other wetsuits that I've had as well have been pretty high end. But this one is a different class to any other wetsuit that I tried. I can say that very genuinely, the Maverick X wetsuit is insanely fast. So yeah, I have to give a shout out to that. And as a part of the sponsorship as well, Roka gives 20% off the entire order for anybody who orders from roka.com using the promo code That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. So again, that's 20% off the entire order at roka.com using the promo code That Triathlon Show. Alright, so let's get on with the show. Apologies in advance for the dog that is barking in the background. Let's hope he quiets down at some point, but we'll just have to live with it otherwise. This is my podcasting studio in Lisbon, and it comes with some dogs, some stray, some not stray, but many of them are barking, so not much to do about that. Anyway, today's topic is basically a review of a fairly recent, from last year actually, but so a 1-year-old study that is called Running Technique is an Important Component of Running Economy and Performance. It's a study that was conducted by Jonathan Foland and colleagues at the University of Loughborough. They do a lot of great research in endurance sports, and their quest was to establish the relationship between running technique or running form and both running economy and running performance. And this is the largest study by far that has been done on this topic. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, for those of you who are not aware, running economy, we need to define that. It's the energy cost or the oxygen cost of running a given distance at a sub-maximal velocity. So it's like if we can use a car analogy. If you're driving a car at I don't know, 50 kilometers an hour or so, how much fuel do you consume to go 1 kilometer? An economical car will use less fuel than a less economical car, even though they're both going at the same speed. And it's the same with runners and athletes. Some are more economical than others. And even for athletes that are of fairly similar ability, one athlete may have potentially a higher VO2 max or a higher anaerobic threshold, but the other runner may be more economical and for that reason potentially better over long distances. So running economy is a very important parameter and predictor of running performance. To get started with what this study is all about, I want to actually read from the abstract fairly directly. I'll leave some stuff out and change it to sound less technical simply, but I want to give you a high-level overview to start with. So the abstract goes like this. Purpose. This study aimed to determine the relationship between individual and combined kinematic measures of technique with both running economy and performance. Methods. 97 endurance runners, 47 females, of diverse competitive standards performed a discontinuous protocol of incremental treadmill running. Measurements included three-dimensional full-body kinematics, respiratory gases to determine energy cost, and velocity of lactate turn point. 5 categories of kinematic measures, including vertical oscillation, braking, posture, stride parameters, and lower limb angles, as well as locomotory, did I say that right? Locomotory energy cost were averaged across the highest common velocity below the velocity of the lactate turn point. Performance was measured as season's best time converted to an equivalent 10K time. Just editor's note here, the lactate turn point, they use that term in this case for anaerobic threshold, which you're more used to me talking about. So lactate turn point here means anaerobic threshold, and in this study, if you go and read it, if you see the term lactate threshold, that refers to the aerobic threshold. Results. Numerous kinematic variables were correlated with running economy and performance, 19 with economy and 11 with performance. Regression analysis found 3 variables, including pelvic vertical oscillation during ground contact, normalized to height, minimum knee joint angle during ground contact, and minimum horizontal pelvis velocity, or braking, explained 39% of running economy variability. In addition, 4 variables, again, minimum horizontal pelvis velocity, or braking, Shank touchdown angle, duty factor, and trunk forward lean combined to explain 31% of the variability in performance as seasonal best time. Conclusions. This study provides novel and robust evidence that technique explains a substantial proportion of the variance in running economy and performance. We recommend that runners and coaches are attentive to specific aspects of stride parameters and lower limb angles, in part to optimize pelvis movement and ultimately enhance performance. Alright, so that was quite a mouthful, but we'll get into it, and I'll try to explain it in simple terms so that you can understand the big takeaways and the important points here. But before we do that, actually, I should say that even though this study found that there are a lot of things that are related to and actually explain quite a lot of running economy and performance that are related to your running technique, that doesn't mean that you should go out and try to completely do a makeover of your running stride necessarily. I would advise a bit of caution with that, but I would advise to, as a first step, just become aware of how you're running and how that relates to some of the variables that we'll talk about that are important in this episode. And that awareness is the first step, and then you need to make an assessment of if this is something that you can realistically change and if that will help you. You can do some testing, of course, in training and see how that goes. And if you decide that based on the assessment that it's something that you need to work on, this also depends on your current running ability, your goals, etc. Even your things like your injury history or propensity for injuries. Then if you decide that based on all of this it makes sense to make some changes, then you can go and look at these variables again and see how you can best work on trying to improve that. But it's not as simple as just going and making a complete overhaul of your entire running form right away based on this episode. I wouldn't recommend that by any means. This is just to bring you awareness and give you some information about what we know today about running technique and running form and how it relates to performance and economy. So, let's get into some more background and context. There have been a few studies before on this topic. So first, if we talk about how technique relates to performance, the authors of this study writes that the only study that has directly examined the relationship between running kinematics and performance found no significant associations in 16 moderate to high level runners. A few small studies have compared groups of sub-elite runners with elite athletes, finding no or subtle differences in kinematic variables. I think there's actually a typo there because it says comparing sub-elite to sub-elite. I guess it should be sub-elite to elite. But anyway, the point being here that very little work has been done before, only one proper study with 16 runners, and that found no results. Studies on how technique relates to running economy. About that, the authors write that investigations into the relationship between running economy and technique have typically been small cohort studies with less than 25 participants of relatively homogeneous groups of runners, limited kinematic measurements, and limitations in the methods used. Consequently, we know very little about the relationship between running kinematics and running economy and performance. And a recent review of strategies to improve running economy provided no recommendations with regard to running technique. And how does this study fit into this picture? The authors write here that despite the lack of consensus in the literature, we postulated that 5 aspects of kinematics may influence running economy and performance. Stride parameters, lower limb angles, vertical oscillation, changes in horizontal velocity during ground contact, aka braking, and trunk and pelvis orientation, aka posture. Given that running economy and performance are known to be influenced by a range of anthropometric, physiological, and intrinsic musculoskeletal variables, the contribution of technique would seem to be relatively modest. In this case, a statistically robust investigation dictated the recruitment of a large, heterogeneous cohort including recreational and elite runners to provide a range of running techniques, economy, and performance. So that's, in a nutshell, where this study sits in comparison to the work that has been previously done by other studies. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of how they did it and what they found. For participants, they recruited 97 regular runners, which means they were running 2 times or more per week, and considered running to be their primary sport or physical activity. These 97 included 29 elite runners, 15 males with a season best 10K time of better than 31 minutes, and 14 females with a season best of better than 35 minutes for the 10K. And 68 recreational runners, and males had a time better than 52 minutes for the 10K. There were 35 of them, and the females, 33 of them, had a 10K best of better than 57 minutes. They all had a BMI, body mass index, of less than 24, and they were free from moderate injury in the past 3 months and free from minor injuries in the past 1 month. So that they had been doing some running recently. So it's fairly standard, but it's a good way to recruit participants. And the important thing here is that they had 97 of them, which is a massive amount. When you read a lot of sports science research studies that I do, you get used to seeing participants range in the 10 to 20 in many studies, in most studies actually. So 97 for a study in the sports science field it's a lot. It's very rare to see this big a number of participants. The protocol that they used was fairly standard, running on the treadmill, an incremental running protocol starting from a very easy pace and then increasingly getting faster. They took lactate samples to be able to measure lactate threshold, and they also used respiratory gas analysis to be able to determine oxygen consumption and CO2 volume exhaled, and that allows them then to calculate running economy. And they had a series of cameras that I won't go into details, but basically they were allowed them to do all sorts of fancy analysis of different stride parameters, running technique, etc. So that was all set up so that they could do that at any time during the test. The one thing with the protocol that is a bit of a question mark to me is that they chose to calculate running economy for all runners at a speed that was very low because they wanted to have it calculated at a sub-maximal, so below the anaerobic threshold velocity. And for the slower runners, this was of course much slower than for the elite runners, which meant that they calculated running economy data in the range from 10 to 12 kilometers per hour. So that is 5 minutes per kilometer or faster, or 8-minute miles, or 5 minutes per kilometer or slower, slightly slower, and 8 minutes per mile or slightly slower than that. And for the elite runners, it's interesting. I don't know the answer to this, to be honest, but I think that they may be less economical at that speed than they would be at something that is a bit closer to their threshold, even though it's still far away from that. So I don't know if that's not something that the researchers or the authors of the study go into in any more detail. They may have had good reasons for that, but that's just something that stood out to me as not necessarily the way I would have imagined being the most optimal way to do things. But then again, I'm just looking at this from the outside, so I'm not saying that I know better than these researchers. They may have very valid reasons for doing so, but I do want to point out any potential issues with the study because it's not almost no study is complete gospel. There's always things that you need to be critical about. So let's get into the most exciting part of all of this, the results of the study. First, some general things that they pointed out about the participants and their economy, performance, and kinematics. The The 10K time, as we already talked about, it varied substantially because they had both elite runners and very much recreational runners. So the range here was from 29 minutes to almost 57 minutes as their personal bests. The average was 40 minutes and 14 seconds for their 10K best time. Likewise, the velocity at the lactate threshold, or lactate turn point, as using the same terminology as in the paper, was 15.7 kilometers per hour. So that would be, I would say off the top of my head, something like 350 pace, 3 minutes and 50 seconds per kilometer. And equivalently in mile pace, it would be something like 6:10 pace, maybe 6 minutes 10 seconds per mile. These are just off the top of my head. You need to do the conversions yourself, but I think it's something like that. And but the variability here, of course, again, was very big. The elite runners were significantly faster than that, and the slower runners were slower. So the slowest velocity at lactate turn point was 12 kilometers an hour, which is 5 minutes per kilometer or 8 minutes per mile. And the fastest were 20.5 kilometers per hour, which is a bit faster than 3 minutes per kilometer or whatever that is per mile. I don't know that one. Running economy at the 10 to 12 kilometers per hour, where they calculated that, varied by almost twofold. So that was a big difference, of course. Some runners are twice as economical as others. And this measure was independent of body mass. As for the kinematics, some runners had more than twice the vertical oscillation of other runners, and that was normalized for height. So that is important that they did that. And braking measures also varied by a 2 to 2.8 fold range. That is how much your horizontal velocity slows down and speeds up again. You want to keep that speed, of course, fairly constant and not have too many decelerations and accelerations. And some runners were twice as good as that as others, or almost 3 times as good in some cases. Stride rate varied from 72 to 111 strides per minute. And that's actually calculating, revolutions per minute. So steps per minute would be twice that, so 144 to 222 steps per minute. Stride length normalized to height had less variability. That was in the 1.5, at most 1.5 range, in terms of how much longer some runners' strides were to others. Normalized to height, that is. Ground contact time, duty factor, and leg swing time. Duty factor means simply what is the percentage of time that your foot is on the ground or is touching the ground compared to the time of your overall stride cycle. That varied more than 1.6 fold. And then they list some other variations in limb angles and range of motion, etc., that are a bit difficult really to describe and illustrate on a podcast. So I will have a link to a figure in the show notes. So on the show notes, scientifictriathlon.com/TTS136, there will be a figure that shows what these angles really mean that the study talks about. But I won't go into detail here now with how much these things varied, because it will just be really bad listening experience and you won't get much out of it. We'll talk a little bit about the ones that really mattered a bit later when we get into the analysis that they did of these results. And that is what we are actually starting to do now. So let's talk about the correlations between this running technique and running economy and performance. So they assessed 24 kinematic variables in this study, and 19 of these were correlated with running economy, and 11 with running performance. And the relationships were weak to moderate. So in this case, Maybe if you go and look at the study and the different correlations, you can maybe ignore the weak correlations and focus more so on the moderate correlations, because you don't want to try to change 11 different variables, or let alone 19 at the same time. If you want to change anything, you want to focus on the big, most important things. Without going into too much statistical geekery, just to quickly point out that when we talk about correlations here, what this study did is that they tried to simply calculate if there is an association between a single variable, for example, braking, and running economy or running performance. They did this one at a time for each variable. What they did do, I should point out if there are any scientists listening, is that they did correct for multiple testing, as you should do if you do these sorts of analysis. But I won't go into much more detail on that. But just in general, these correlations, while they can be illustrative and quite useful, it's also just a correlation. And since there are many interconnected kinematic variables here and other things as well that are connected with all of this, a correlation is only a correlation. So let's say, for example, that stride rate is correlated with better running economy. That does not mean that increasing your stride rate will improve your running economy. That's not how it works. It's just that there is a correlation there, and the reason may be in the variable itself, but it may also be in other factors. So correlation is a bit of a weaker measure. But then what this study did, that is the most powerful thing, and the thing that we'll focus the most on, is that they did a multiple linear regression analysis where they combined all of these different variables using some methods that we don't need to go into, and just to find which combination of a few variables explains most of the difference in running economy and in running performance, if any combination. And this model, the regression model, did find that 39.4% of the variance in running economy was explained by a combination of 3 different variables. These variables were the vertical oscillation of the pelvis normalized to height, the minimum knee joint angle during ground contact, and the minimum horizontal velocity of the pelvis, aka braking, or minimizing braking. So that explained 39% of the variability in running economy. So that's pretty big, a big finding, that these 3 variables taken together can explain a big chunk of the variance that you see in a very economical runner compared to a non-economical runner. Likewise, the regression analysis for performance found that 30.5% of this variance could be explained by a combination of 4 different variables. And these were the minimum horizontal velocity of the pelvis, again, so braking, the shank angle at touchdown, the duty factor, so again, that's the percentage of time that your foot is in contact with the ground compared to your overall stride cycle duration. And a smaller percentage here is better. You don't want to be in contact with the ground a long time. And finally, forward lean of the trunk. So again, since I had explained a few things there, to make sure that you got the 4 variables, it was the minimal horizontal velocity of the pelvis, braking, the shank angle at touchdown, the duty factor, and the forward lean of the trunk. So let's then talk about the conclusions and what this all means. And I'll steal some of these conclusions directly from the study and what the authors wrote, but add in some of my own thoughts as well. So it'll be a bit of a mix, which you'll notice if you go and read the study, which again I'll link to in the episode description and in the show notes. So the big picture finding, I guess, is this. Previous research have not found any kinematic variables to be related to performance, and very unconvincing, inconsistent evidence for isolated variables to be related to running economy. And whereas this study found quite strong evidence because the variables that were included in the regression analysis and were correlated with these with performance and economy were consistent, which increases the validity of them. So this is a big step forward in terms of the science of running form, running technique, and how it relates to economy and performance. And obviously the fact that they had a big cohort of runners makes it all the better, because we're used to seeing very small studies, and we always need to be very, very critical when we see that, but which we still need to be. But in this case, this gives a lot of credibility when you have 97 runners take part in a study. So that's a conclusion about how these findings relate to the big picture of sports science, of running science, really. When it comes to the individual technique and running form variables that the researchers highlight in the conclusion, they choose to focus on very wisely on the ones with stronger correlations, and not the ones with weak correlations, even though they were statistically significant, because at least in part of the fact they did a lot of testing, and you can overinterpret results when you do that. So they focused on the strong correlations and the ones that appeared in the regression models, and also ones that were statistically significantly correlated with multiple variables, like with running economy and performance and velocity at the lactate threshold, etc. So that's a bit about how they chose to highlight different variables. So if we go into a few of these parameters and briefly touch upon them one more time, the first group of parameters that this study investigated was braking. And all of these different ways to measure braking basically correlated with economy and performance. But they found that the strongest variable, the best way to measure braking, was to measure the minimum velocity of the pelvis. And the higher minimum velocity of the pelvis is better. So that's basically how to measure that. And that was included in all 3 regression models, which makes it very, very likely that this actually is a legit parameter to look at and think about. Then for vertical oscillation, the one parameter that was the strongest correlated with economy and performance was the vertical displacement of the pelvis during ground contact, and that was normalized to the height of the runner. And this parameter, vertical oscillation at ground contact, was by far the strongest variable in the regression model for running economy. So in itself, the vertical oscillation at ground contact explains 28% of the variance in running economy. So that's massive when you consider that the whole model with all 3 parameters was 39%. So this definitely seems to be a very important variable for running technique as well. For the posture parameters, it was shown that holding the trunk in a steady position, not having a lot of transverse rotation or rotation backwards and forwards, that is not having the rotation, I should clarify, is related to better economy and to a lesser extent also to better performance. So it highlights again what we already know, that unnecessary movements should be eliminated in running. Forward lean of the trunk was not related to running economy, but it was weakly correlated with and also included in the regression model of actual performance, which is interesting. But this is one that I would advise caution with, because especially for triathletes, if you try to focus too much on the forward lean, it easily becomes bending at the waist, which is not really a good way to run if you have a forward lean, it should come from your ankles, and you should have a forward lean all the way throughout your body, which is also, but this is not specified in this study. But I'm sure you have seen these triathletes coming off their triathlon bikes. They have been in them all day, maybe in an Ironman, and then they're running like they have their nose like 1 meter in front of their feet, which is you can just see that it's uneconomical, and that's not. You don't want to use this knowledge that forward lean of the trunk may be correlated with performance, or is correlated with performance, but you don't want to use that unresponsibly. You want to use it responsibly, basically, and be a bit cautious with how you do that, and do not bend forward at the waist. So stride parameters, a shorter ground contact time, and related to that, a lower duty factor, were both correlated with better running performance. And it was the duty factor actually, and not ground contact time, that contributed to the regression models for performance. And that can be explained probably by the fact that if you are somebody who is quite tall and lanky, then you may not have a particularly fast stride rate, and you may also have a slightly higher ground contact time, especially if you're maybe even a bit heavier, not overweight, but heavier in general because you're bigger. But then your stride length may be longer instead. So the duty factor kind of takes that into account, which ground contact time doesn't, because ground contact time is an absolute, but the duty factor is your ground contact time as a percentage of your entire stride cycle, as I mentioned. So it makes sense when you think about it. It's a bit more difficult to calculate because your Garmin's generally already calculate the ground contact time and show it to you. But all that to say, there was a correlation there, and the duty factor was involved in the regression model for performance, but neither of these variables were associated with running economy. And another stride parameter topic that is very important, and we've talked about this before many times, is that a higher stride rate and a shorter stride compared normalized to your height, again, they were both correlated with better running economy, and this suggests that overstriding is a problem for uneconomical runners. So that means that you have a low but relatively long stride, and hits the ground in front of your center of mass. So try to reduce that stride length and instead have a higher stride rate to become more economical. And finally, for the lower limb angles, I'll only pick out one, and that is the Shank angle at touchdown, because that was included in the regression model for performance and explained 10% of the variance of a total of 31% in the entire model. So that's an important one. But for the rest, I'll just refer you to go and read the study if you're really interested in this, because for 99% of the listeners, I can't explain this in a way that won't make you tune out and skip to the next podcast on your list. So I'll just refer the 1% that are interested to partially to the show notes on my website, but also directly. I guess better to go directly to the study and actually get all the details of that in this case. The reason, if you're interested in why there are more variables correlated with running economy as compared to running performance, that is that, of course, in running performance, it's an uncontrolled condition, really. So weather might have an impact and all those sorts of things. It wasn't measured as part of the study. They were just asked what their best running performance had been, and we don't know what actually happened in the race, weather, terrain, etc. So it's less controlled, and also it's the fact that in running performance, running economy is just one part of what makes you run fast. Then you need those other physiological predictors like VO2 max, lactate threshold, but also mental fortitude. So there is so much that goes into running performance. Running economy is just one part of that. So that explains why there were 19 variables correlated with economy and 11 with running performance. And it also explains why the regression model for running economy could explain 40% of the variance in running economy, and the regression model for performance could only explain 31% of the variance in performance. So let's wrap up with some key takeaways here. First, running technique explains a substantial proportion of the variance in running economy. More specifically, it explains 39% of that variance, and in performance with 31%. Second, this means that you should become aware and pay some attention to certain parameters that you may want to start working on and improving on. And the most important ones based on this study are the consistent forward velocity of the pelvis, and try to not have a large dip in forward velocity of it when your foot hits the ground. Then we have a minimum vertical oscillation of the pelvis, especially at ground contact, and also trying to do these things like minimizing rotation of the upper body in various planes that you don't want to. Try to keep that steady. And some stride parameters, duty factor, ground contact time, and stride rate, they are important as well. And also some lower limb angles that you can find in the original study. They may help to, if not directly improve your economy and performance, at least they may help you enhance, for example, minimize the braking and keep that forward velocity of the pelvis up. And that's something that the authors commented on as well, that it's not so much about focusing on the individual parameters really, as it is because they are all interconnected, or most of them are anyway. So we should be cautious with placing too much emphasis on any one parameter, but we can work on a group of parameters, and they will probably bring each other up as well if you improve some of them. As usual, you can find the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. If you have comments or questions about this episode, leave them there. Then I have some exciting news for you about the training camp in the Algarve that I mentioned last week. I will have a link in the show notes, or you can go directly to scientifictriathlon.com and click through to training camps. I can now confirm that the date of this camp will be the 20th to the 27th of October, and that is Algarve, southern Portugal. Great weather, great cycling, great food. We will be staying at the Alfamar Beach and Sport Resort in Olhos de Agua, and there are 12 slots available. So it will be very individual, because we will have actually 3 different coaches there. Myself and former professional cyclist Yuri George, who is a local. He knows the area very well. He has helped me out a lot with organizing this, and he's the founder of Velo Performance. And also a triathlon coach, Fiona, who also is he's Yuri's girlfriend and also works for Velo Performance. So she's a triathlon coach. She has now focused more on cycling recently herself. But we will have more than enough manpower to split participants into different groups depending on ability. So that's something to keep in mind, that you will get all the individual attention needed. You will be able to train to your own level because we have the limited number of slots and enough coaches to be able to handle that. So if you want to register or ask more, just email me, michael@scientifictriathlon.com. You will get a nice €100 discount as a podcast listener. Usually this camp would be €870 for the public, but for podcast listeners, it's €770 when you register within July. Any questions, again, just email me and ask, and I can help clarify. Finally, big thank you to our sponsors who help keep the show going. First, we have Roka that you can find on roka.com. If you're looking for triathlon apparel, wetsuits, sunglasses, swim equipment, or tri-suits or similar, they have got you covered, and their quality is second to none. That's why they are the biggest triathlon apparel brand in the world. And you can check them out, and you can order for a 20% discount on your entire order on roka.com when you use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. And thank you to Precision Hydration. It is summer and it is hot, and you need to stay hydrated, and that is not just water. You also need to cover your electrolyte needs, and standard sports drink don't take into account how much variance there is in how much sodium you lose in your sweat, which is where Precision Hydration comes in. They have great tasting products that you can tailor to your sweat needs, and you can get your first box or tube of Precision Hydration for free on precisionhydration.com when you use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.